We then scaled this up to a whole neighborhood. This is where we submitted a grant to the NIH. They rejected us one year. We had to come back and submit another year. So it's like just many years of actually trying to get it off the ground. But eventually, we basically got $8 million from the National Institute of Health, and we got a matching grant of about $9 or $10 million that was like lead fundraiser from the Nature Conservancy. And in the last 4 years, we basically set up a clinical trial that you would normally do for a drug test. It just happens to be that our drugs are trees in this context.
What's your quote? You have a quote, right?
Yeah. Nature is our drug. We're looking at these like steep slopes and we're just saying, well, ecologically, they're going to be different. You know, these north slopes are going to be more shaded. South slopes are going to get burnt. We need to have different species. So it was this kind of constant battle. We actually built what we called like a green roof torture chamber at the nursery to test different plants. And so it was this battle of like, do we have mono? I sort of see a lot of like philanthropic work as a crutch. And also it's interesting because I see it as it's sort of like a broken capitalist driven form where basically we've got people giving away money that have too much of it because they have to. But then they're saying like, I'm going to decide where this goes. And I'm specifically going to say that you, as the community I'm giving it to, cannot profit off of the money that I'm giving you, right? Where I am actually interested in equity from like a financial equity standpoint too. It's like, why can't this small local business be benefiting from the philanthropist and like that person building equity in their community? Like, I think that's a huge thing that's not addressed.
To know a language in the land shape each other over time. Native tongues wake up medicine deep inside. We were stolen from the land.
Welcome to Creating Spaces. I'm your host, Alana Corpus.
And I'm your co-host, David Mall.
And we are here to shed some light on landscape design, construction, and how to create your space to add value to your life in your home. Thank you for who's here, and then I'll just like wait for other people to come in. Anyone is welcome to put questions in the chat and say hello. I want to introduce Brent Bucknum of Hyphae Design, really innovative, pushing the envelope designer and coordinator. I think the best thing would just be, you know, you're such a multifaceted person. I feel like 1 hour is like not enough to like delve into everything that you've done in your lifetime or in your career, but we'll have fun with that. When I first met you, you had a live work situation in West Oakland. And I remember having a conversation with you about some bamboo mitigation, stormwater mitigation in Tijuana. It was like a nonprofit that you were kind of spearheading. So I kind of wanted to do a little introduction of like, you know, the beginning of Hyphae Design and kind of what you wanted to set up doing and kind of how it's migrated and like what your company represents. And then we'll just keep going through and having fun with this conversation.
The origins of Hyphae Design Lab, which is the name of our business, we started officially in 2008. And so I had previously worked at a company called Rana Creek Habitat Restoration based in Carmel Valley. And we'd really started to like push the envelope from sort of doing more ecological restoration in the rural context to really sort of bringing that into the city, working with a lot of architects and landscape architects of how to integrate, for example, like green roofs that are ecologically driven into architectural projects and like urban context. So we became really known for like how and what species work really well on green roofs, like California, for example, being a lot different than places where they've been built before. But what I was seeing coming from Rana Creek was we'd often be brought in to work on this one piece, like the green roof, but we wouldn't be thinking about all of the systems holistically. So I think one of the biggest challenges I was seeing is, for example, sort of helped lead the design at Rana Creek on the California Academy of Sciences green roof. I don't know if folks have been there, but really big roof in San Francisco. And the challenge we were seeing was that it was not holistically considered. So we designed this ecological, really innovative green roof, but then we were using potable water to irrigate it. I left in 2008 to start Hyphae Design Lab. The focus was really to try to do more integrated design and push the envelope, especially around water management in California, knowing that that was sort of such a critical issue at the time and consistently. And so for us, the name Hyphae started, you know, as sort of a double entendre, obviously like the Hyphae hip hop movement in Oakland, but also metaphorically hyphae being like mycelium fungus. From our standpoint, we wanted to be interdisciplinary and help like bridge the gaps between disciplines, whether it was the architect, landscape architect, civil engineers, mechanical engineers, and on top of that, like more innovative researchers. So we saw, and I feel like we're still in this era with a lot of green building, that we need to be doing like research in practice and trying things and bringing it out of academia into practice. So that kind of was the origin of our work. And even though we've
connecting all the dots.
yeah, connecting all the dots. So we like the metaphor of like the mycelium fungus, right? Is like what connects those dots in the soil. So that's sort of our role on a lot of projects. So we have landscape architects, civil engineers, architecturally trained people. We also have like biochemists on our staff. So we, in some cases, will perform any of those disciplines, but in other cases, we're happy to just be in between, getting everyone to work together. So in some projects, we're brought in to try to get the landscape architect to work with the civil engineer. And the fact that we both have civil engineers and landscape, we can kind of bridge that gap and speak in how civil engineers might speak, so on and so forth. So that was kind of the origins of our work. I left previous firm in 2008 thinking I was going to have a bunch of giant projects. And then there was the economic crash. And so I thought it was kind of serendipitous in that, partly due to just...
There were a lot of good businesses that started their business in 2008.
Yeah.
And it's actually like, if you could make it through that, then that gave you like the strength so that like in the good years, you were ready.
Exactly. Yeah. No, if you can survive that, rushing the checks to the bank. So for us, it was interesting because we had a bunch of sort of bigger projects teed up, like multifamily housing and things like that. And then all of that collapsed. And the main market that persisted was residential. And so for us, it was kind of came at an awesome time because residential clients were also the ones that could help us push the envelope and like help actually fund things like innovative gray water and rainwater projects. And so we have moved on to primarily not do single family residential now, but we still see the value of all those scales because it's like those people can take bigger risks. They have bigger budgets to do smaller things. And then they can like de-risk it for much bigger projects because you're like, hey, we did it here and it's working. So I see like a huge value in leveraging all the different environments. But we went literally from there, like designing and building most of the systems in our first 3 to 5 years, which I find like epically important just from the standpoint of people actually learning in the field is so huge. We now sometimes get people coming out of school and like one of the first things I do is I'll just like send them into the plumbing store blind with a list, and like 6 hours later,
they come back with half the list. Yeah,
they'll come back with half the list, but they will have like learned an epic amount, right? And then also like they're going to always have a better idea of like how do you actually put the thing together. So we try to still throw people into the trenches as much as possible. At this point, we work a lot more on like bigger projects. And so then it's like often union driven. And like we worked on the SF MoMA and helped design this big living wall. Like we weren't even allowed to touch a single plant, even though like we are often trying to like work hand in hand with contractors and be out there and collaborate. So it's interesting as you get onto bigger projects and it becomes very formalized, like
you're into it's done for a reason. It's done for a specific reason. I have a couple of images from some of your work, and I was going to just screen share the Academy of Science if you zoom in all the way with the
this one here.
Yeah, that's awesome. That was actually an interesting project too, because at the time we were really pushing the architect Renzo Piano to sort of go more naturalistic. But he's, being a modernist, he's like, I want the roof to be uniform, right? And like to have all the same species everywhere. And we're looking at these like steep slopes and we're just, we're saying, well, ecologically, they're going to be different. These north slopes are going to be more shaded. South slopes are, going to get burnt. We need to have different species. So it was this kind of constant battle. And we actually built what we called like a green roof torture chamber at the nursery to test different plants. It was this battle of like, do we have monoculture, or it wasn't monoculture, it was like 8 species, but do we place them all evenly, or do we actually start to place them where they will go ecologically? And he went for like uniform planting, which was weird. But the funny thing is over time, it's like evolving to find itself, right? So it's like
Yeah.
really,
I remember when that first was installed, and I think the first couple years it really like struggled, like with the
yeah,
wind, the elements, like it looked bad, to be
I
honest.
agree.
But then like in the past, I haven't been to the Academy of Science in probably 5 years, but in the past years, it's amazing. And like you said, like the plants actually migrate to their own areas. Like you might have planted it here, but the seeds and the birds and like just how
It's naturalized.
yeah, how the ecology of the space goes. And I'm sure the highland in New York is a similar thing. It's so lush and beautiful, and like it's like the plants and the species kind of found their special spot.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's like one of the most compelling parts. It was a different green roof project we worked on, but it was very interesting and telling, where there were actually 3 green roofs. 2 of them were really easy to access from the ground, and one like required a whole ladder. And when we went to assess it like 5 years later, basically the one that was hard to access had the most diversity, the most coverage, and the ones that were easier to access had like most weeds and the most bare spots. And it's because their maintenance guy was getting up there and clearing things more. And then like as you bring these bigger clearings, they then like bring the weeds in. So it was just really funny to have that like natural study, I guess. It was pretty
Interesting. So
The
just to,
dichotomy of
so the
right.
the actual like maintenance was creating more weeds.
Yeah, that's what we were finding.
Just like let the species do their
Right.
own migration.
Let them figure it out.
Yeah. I was curious about just like the Academy of Science, how many different interdisciplinary parts. I mean, obviously the Academy of Science is like a huge thing, but just for the green roof itself, how many different interdisciplinary parts and people and specialists needed to come together to make this? We don't need to talk about like the after.
It's interesting also like the context of when this was designed. So we were designing it almost 20 years ago, which is crazy now to think about. And so I would say also like the industry has come a huge way in California. So the biggest risks I would say at this time were like most green roofs have been designed around really temperate climates, originating more in Europe and Germany and like kind of spreading out throughout other parts of the US. But all of the soil designs and the plant material that were being spec'd just don't make sense in California. So like most of them are like super nutrient poor, to be lightweight, and use like expanded clay and shale. So we were developing soils that were based on lava rock, which were scoria, which we could find here. And we were building, as this shows, on like epically steep slopes. So we had these 60-degree slopes, which were really hard and stressful because they were like, what happens if this green roof slides off into this really expensive atrium?
Yeah.
So there were a lot of risks there. So we were like using pretty intense soil stabilization on steep areas. One of the biggest challenges I see on a lot of these projects is like when we're integrating greenery, whether it's like a green roof or a living wall, into these really iconic projects, they also want instant gratification. So we basically try to convince people to allow, a little bit of evolution, but many times they don't go with it. So in this project, we actually invented these biodegradable trays. So they were made out of coconut coir. So we actually pre-grew a lot of the plants in the nursery and then brought them out to the site. In this case, we had like soil scientists helping us develop soil. We had a nursery, our own nursery at the time at Rana Creek, where we were like doing testing on the plants for over 2 years in this like green roof torture chamber, obviously like waterproofing consultants, and then working with the structural engineers. So there's, for better or worse, the roof then impacts and permeates a lot of disciplines.
How much of your study of like discovering where plants would grow best and sort of your test room that you were doing at the nursery, did you find that you were like there was completely scrapped areas that you just thought this would go right and then it was just didn't go as you had thought it would?
Yeah, at one point I think we were testing over 50 species, and we found like a list of basically like 9 rock stars that were going to survive anywhere in any of the conditions. And so they kind of, due to like wanting to simplify it, like go with those 9. And that's where we then started to argue, well, let's do some more in these areas and more in these areas. And they were like, no, let's do it uniformly across everything. And that obviously turned into this cool evolution. But we also did what we called the eco hijack, which was after we put out the 9 species, we also did what was sort of like an observation garden right around the viewing deck, where we planted almost 50 species. And those have now also like gone out and found themselves around the roof, which is cool.
Wow.
So we kind of like seeded it there, which was interesting.
Huh.
So yeah, around the viewing deck, they were like, well, we can do a more diverse garden. The really interesting thing too that we find is that like on this project, you can do so much preliminary research and write like super detailed specifications. But then what starts to happen is like the contracting process takes over. So for example, one of the big things, Alana, as you were saying, like early on, the roof did not look good. One of the main reasons for that was actually we'd sort of specified pretty nutrient poor soils, because that's what a lot of these sort of dune species are used to. And so we were modeling it off of like the historical dune species that would have been there. But then what happened is as it goes into contracting, then the contractors are like, hey, we could save 200 grand by like using this slightly different soil spec or this or that. And so the soil that ended up both in the trays and on the roof was like had really high nitrogen, and we basically like fried out all of the like sensitive perennials at first and had to like go reseed them. So like the fact that we use these really hotter soils basically just fried out all these sensitive perennials. It's like the translation from like really good research and design, even though we might know a lot of problems and like still not know, there's this whole other era of like when it's actually going to contracting and being value engineered that's like almost as important, but goes by super quickly.
Right. And like what you're saying is like if you have the contractor and they're sort of sussing out for themselves and thinking, oh, I can save the customer this much money, they're not necessarily thinking that a ton of research went into the thing. Had spent so much time to make sure it was successful.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, take our information. That is so fun. Well, let's talk about one that is a little more recent, which is the Kentucky Louisville project.
First thing we got to start, you're going to get in trouble if you go to Louisville and say Louisville.
Louisville is Louisville.
Yeah. So
how do I say it? How do I say it?
Louisville.
Louisville.
Louisville. I guess, yeah, just sort of paint the evolution. You're going from like project 1 here to project 50 that we're kind of the arc there is, we went from doing a lot of smaller residential rainwater greywater systems as we started Hyphae. We started our organization in West Oakland. We worked really, really intensively with a group called West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. And we started to say, how can green...
Are they still around? Are they
very much. Yeah, we have many projects with them. There was just actually a cool Washington Post feature on them on Sunday.
What's the name? Can you say the name of the organization again? Because I'm going to look them up.
Yeah, it's called the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. Okay. WOEP to those of us who use the acronym. But it was started by 2 community members, Miss Margaret Gordon and Brian Beveridge. And they went, Miss Margaret started 25 years ago. She'd been a housekeeper, and she just started and now she's one of the most powerful environmental justice organizers in the country. So we work with them. They happen to be my neighbors in West Oakland, and that really started driving a lot of the work we're doing. But these bigger projects also just take more time to get, right? Like we might apply for a grant and it takes 3 years to actually start it. So that's really difficult for us as a small business to plan around that. And you're like, well, how am I going to do stuff in the interim? So that's a big, interesting challenge in having a small business trying to do sort of big long-term projects. But through that work, we're really starting to tackle health-related issues, which is kind of core problems of EJ communities. We were dealing with lead-contaminated soils, so helping come up with bioremediation strategies and working with them in the EPA. And then a lot of what we're working on was sort of this idea that we were just conceiving of at the time, 10, 15 years ago, which was vegetated buffers. So it was looking back to how agrarian communities had used vegetation as windbreaks for agricultural purposes, but we were repurposing that into an idea where we could actually buffer near road communities from the pollution that they're exposed to. So that work has basically catapulted us to do a lot more work locally and nationally with EJ communities. So we're working now in Stockton, Richmond, LA, all over the state, and then in Dallas and Louisville. So Louisville is super exciting because we partnered with a cardiovascular researcher there from the Envirom Institute. And they're really focused on studying the impacts of human health from the environment that they're in. And for all of us, environment is obviously like the trees that are around you, but it's also like the cars and trucks and roads. So the way we as ecologists look at the environment is it's like everything around you, whether it's natural or not. And so he had been starting to do, Dr. Rudy Bhatnagar at the Environment Institute had done some studies that were really just like correlations where he had all these patients that they're in like long-term studies and saying, wow, why are these patients that are in greener areas in Louisville actually having different health outcomes, even when everything else is controlled, than people around less green environments? But it was very like correlative. And so he said, I've really been wanting to do kind of a clinical study on this, but the problem with ecology and landscape is it takes so long for a tree to grow, and like we can't get a grant for 50 years to see what happens. And so
Can you say real quick, can you say Louisville one more time?
Louisville.
Okay. That's what
so we've been now working with them for over 8 years. I mean, that's how long some of these projects start. So it took like one dinner party that we were both at, because we were on the same board, for us to like conceptualize the project. Because as he was saying, it's so hard to do these studies, I was then looking to like, ironically, high-end residential or like golf course landscapes where we spend huge amounts of money to come bring in giant trees. And so I started to tell him, I'm like, well, like if we can find enough material, we could come spade in like 20-foot tall trees. So that like triggered him to get really excited. So we started writing these grants to the National Institute of Health to say like, we want to do a big neighborhood scale study. We started doing pilots at schools and things. That was actually that other image you had, was us like sort of testing air quality at a school we planted, where we essentially planted a lot of these like fully established trees within a few months. And this pilot we did was to sort of convince the NIH that we weren't completely crazy, even though we were slightly crazy, because no one had done like an environmental intervention study like this. And so we basically planted like 300 big established trees in front of the school and a really busy road between them, and a really busy road and a mall. And we were able to like demonstrate 20-30% reductions in like fine particulate matters between a control and this. And then we also did some like pilot studies where we actually recruited students and faculty from the school to be part of our study. So we were getting blood samples from them, taking hair samples to find heavy metals. And we were at first like, how are we going to convince this school to do this? But literally they like sent out a blast to parents, and we like had oversubscription within days of them wanting to participate and help study it. And so we then scaled this up to a whole neighborhood. And but this is where we submitted a grant to the NIH. They rejected us one year. We had to come back and submit another year. So it's like just many years of actually trying to get it off the ground. But eventually we basically got $8 million from the National Institute of Health. And we got a matching grant of about $9 or $10 million. That was like lead fundraiser from the Nature Conservancy. And in the last 4 years, we basically set up a clinical trial that you would, normally do for a drug test. It just happens to be that our drugs are trees in this context. Nature is our drug. It was funny because now we went from being like ecologists and landscape and architecture people to like pharmaceutical, I guess, developers here in a sense, by just reframing the question or the problem. But in this case, we went into a community, we recruited almost 1,000 people. And so half of those people were in a control neighborhood where we didn't do any planting. And then half of those people were in our, what they call our target neighborhood, or our dosed neighborhood, like being dosed with the drug intervention. It fell on us to figure out like, how do we actually even measure this, the dose of this thing? Because to work with the scientists, we have to look at dose responses, right? Like how much of the drug do we give people and how much effect does it have? So this became kind of a whole new field that we were helping develop, and have subsequently gotten a bunch of additional grants from National Science Foundation and others just to sort of map this. And this is Fletch, who works with me in this photo, and he's actually using a LiDAR scanner, which is what they use for self-driving cars to map things 3-dimensionally. So he's basically like mapping the leaf area density of these trees so we can build simulation tools for like how much air moves through them. So the reality is, like, as we dive into health research, we need to like understand the ecosystem at this microscopic level, requiring totally new tools from how we might have done it from satellite imagery or things in the past.
Yeah.
So
What did you, so Brent, what did you end up discovering? I mean, did you get some raw enough and decipherable enough data to?
yeah, so right now we're in the middle of the study. We recruited people. Then over the last 2 years, we basically planted 8,000 trees in this neighborhood.
Wow.
About 2 or 3,000 of them were large spaded trees. So we had like contractors with cranes placing giant trees along the freeways and in sort of these higher pollution areas. We were working with tons of small landscaping companies, like 7 or 8 of them, all collaborating on like medium scale plantings. And then we were working with tree planting groups, doing kind of like smaller tree planting in people's homes where we couldn't get trees. So it was this massive like outreach campaign, and then a really difficult logistical campaign. It was actually awesome. We hired an ex-colonel from the military to help run it, just because it was like so many people and so constrained, and we were very thankful that we had this colonel running it.
So I wanted to break, because that was just like a lot of information. It's been 5 years since the beginning, or more than that.
Yeah.
And it's still like 20 plus more years, however many grants keep coming in, right? So it's kind of like, and you can fill me in, it's like the initial, the baby of it started with just the conversation. You were at like a conference and you're like, hey, I have this idea. Hey, I have this idea. And you guys came together, and then your company researched and looked, into a grant. And then you did a pilot project.
Yeah.
And then that pilot project allowed you to source out, more funding for a larger scale, and then start getting more recognition, because once that pilot project actually had some scientific weight to it, it had validity. And then from there, you were able to bring in the community groups, the contractors, and 8,000 trees, which is not like a little number.
Yeah, it was a giant undertaking.
Yeah.
Just like finding that many trees, we were like going to nurseries all over the Southwest, like Tennessee to Texas to just like get the trees we needed. It was a giant undertaking. So yeah, there were the 2 major hurdles that I think a lot of people were skeptical about is like, could we transplant a bunch of big trees and not have them all die? Which we were successful. We still had like 10% death, but that's not that bad. And then it was like, are we going to show any change, right? So at the school that we intervened, it depended where the wind was blowing and when, but we were showing like up to 20% removal. So that then allowed us to be like, okay, here's how much this drug might impact in the best conditions. And then we have to do like this, from a scientific standpoint or health standpoint, like the statistical powering. It's like, how many people do we need to try to prove this, and however what distance? And so I would say we're still in the midst of it. We're going to go back this summer and do sort of the first post scan of all the tree planting. And we also have a whole team from Washington University, St. Louis, that's like driving around really high precision air quality equipment. So it's like a giant team of researchers, not just ourselves, that we had to build out over years. So it's, we have academics from many institutions, like over 90 people working on it, from nurses that are going and like collecting blood samples to air quality specialists. Yeah. And I mean, I think the reality too is like, as expensive as it is, 18-20 million or something like that. My take is, I'm also going to be comfortable if we don't have conclusive evidence, because the reality is we probably need to do like 50 of these. If you really look at like health studies, drug companies are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to prove it.
Right. Well, it seems like a drug you can't overdose on. So you can
exactly.
Do you think that this is something that could be implemented? I mean, there's like, for example, Caltrans, they plant trees along the highway. They're responsible for the highways. Is this something that could be a program, or at least the research protocol could be implemented by city or state?
Oh, very much. That's where we're trying to get to. And ironically, I should sort of start from the beginning.
The beginning of the beginning.
No, which you re-triggered me on, which was, we were actually working for Caltrans in 2010 doing a project in LA. And we were sort of trying to push some of these greenbelt issues And they were saying like, oh, well, we don't do that. That's not how we plant. These are the species we use. And so we realized like, well, we can't change this agency as one of their contractors because we have to like use their design standards. So we then were like, we actually need to get contracts and grants to work with them and prove it. So in West Oakland, we're actually working with Caltrans right now. And we had started our work around green belts in West Oakland before Louisville. It happens to just be that we got a bunch more funding faster there. But we've now working with EIP, we've, leveraging a bunch of grants, and it's just time. Like one of them we applied for 3 or 4 years ago and are just getting the money. But it's to literally do a study like you were saying, where we're working with Caltrans to hopefully plant 3.5 acres in West Oakland, right adjacent to the community, as well as planting on city land, and then to study it. And so we hopefully by next year, we're going to be planting that all out and studying it. So our idea is like do bigger and bigger trials and pilots and study them really effectively. So we have this kind of like adaptive management process, we call it, or tools where we're like, build it, study it, scale it, build it, study it, scale it. A lot of what we need to do is realistically change codes in a lot of cities, right? It's like in many cities, they're like, you can only plant these deciduous or, trees 40 feet on center on a street. And what we're finding is like in a lot of really bad air pollution conditions, what we call lollipop trees or street trees are great for like shading, but they actually in the wrong place, they'll trap pollution down at street level and make it worse for people. So a lot of our work is trying to like re-educate planners and landscapers around new strategies of how like the formal structure of these landscapes are really important to their environmental effect.
So you're saying multi-branch trees do a better job?
Yeah. So what we're looking at is like kind of designing these essentially hedgerows, or in many cases, or windbreaks that you would do on a farm back in the day, where it's kind of a combination of broader leaf species as well as that'll like slow some of the wind, and then denser like coniferous species that are gonna like have way denser needle structure. And it's really like the plant density is the main driver of air pollution removal from all the studies we're doing. And you really need like vegetation from the ground up, otherwise it's just going to go under the trees.
Are you saying like a broader leaf is better for carbon sequestration than a fine textured leaf?
Yeah, it's interesting. That one's still, I would say, out for debate. Because it's like the conifers grow slower, but they have a lot more biomass. So it's this interesting debate. But we're also, it's interesting. We're trying to shift this dialogue where like many of the regulators are really exclusively focused on carbon sequestration, which I obviously care about from a climate change standpoint. But with environmental justice communities we're working with, in my mind, it's like the 3rd or 4th priority. My highest priority is like particulate matter and VOCs from emissions impacting people's health. So like carbon in itself isn't impacting people's health on a local level. Obviously it is on like a global climate level. So I think that's one of the things we're trying to shift, is to be like, there's many functions of this. And for me, like when I'm trying to save a community from like asthma and cardiovascular health, like carbon sequestration is the lowest thing on my priority, which is hard when like all the grants.
I mean, that's really hard to say because that's when that's what people are. That's the priority. But Mia had a question, and it was about what trees are the best for carbon sequestration. And I was going to say there's actually an app. You can go to itree.com. Is that correct? Is that the right? It's called itree.com, and you can type in. There's you have to kind of search through the website, but you can type in the tree. And this is what we did for the Richmond School project that we're waiting on a grant for, because part of the grant was carbon sequestration. And so you can look up your city. The city gives like a list of like trees, street trees and priority trees that are recommended for your, whether it's Berkeley, Richmond, for your city. So you can look up those trees. I would start with that list, just because it's a created list by arborist of that city. And then you can type those in to itree.com, and then they will generate the information of like which trees have more carbon sequestration than others. And and then you can and it's really quick, it's like download list, put in the information and you have your answers. So then you can go to the nursery and like look at that tree. This would be my process, is like download a city made list, do the iTree, and then go to a nursery and like actually look at those.
Yeah, another really good resource if folks are in California is Select Tree, which is made by Cal Poly. Matt Ritter is a professor there who's really focused on urban trees, and super great resource. And you can filter that list by a bunch of different things like higher carbon sequestration or
Nice.
roadside pollution tolerance. So there's some good things there. And then we built a site called adaptoakland.org, which is sort of really a plan focused on West Oakland, but there's some good resources there of sort of species that are better for some of these near road, sort of like multi-branching, denser species. So that's another resource. And right now it's like in a lot of cities we're working with the state, we're still having to like battle them. I wouldn't say battle, a spirited discussion around, like, in many cases they're very extremist about like a short list of trees they have. So it's like pushing more diversity. And one of the really interesting debates we've been getting into is around sort of like, how much do you want everything to be native based versus how much do you actually want more biodiversity? Because using natives is restricting your diversity, right? Yeah. So it's a really interesting debate. And the other reality is it's like most of the places we're trying to plant didn't historically have a diverse amount of trees because they're in California and we have like a scrubland arid ecosystem, right? So it's a whole interesting debate.
Oh yeah.
I had a question, Brent. When they're taking these big trees, right? They're taking them with one of those big sort of shovels. Is there any research about, because they're clearly taking all of the mycelium network from that zone and moving it to another zone, which is different than a nursery plant. Maybe you're getting a little bit of that. Has there been any research on how those two things intersect?
I have not looked at that. That would be really interesting. We've done a lot about like kind of inoculating new sites, but not as much of like how these, and what he's saying is what we use is these big spades. So they're like truck mounted spades and they might be 48, 72 inches. And we basically take the whole root ball. So it does limit us which species are good at transplant, right? Some that are really shallow rooting and broad, filamentous roots aren't going to transplant that way, right? So it's like limits what is going to survive well. But I think that's a really interesting study. I'd like to see that.
Yeah, I think my mind's blown about it makes so much sense about the multi-branching, kind of more of a hedgerow versus lollipop. And it's better for the strength of the tree, having those lateral branches lower down. One of the reasons we started this podcast was to inform viewers of tips and advice for landscape and construction. But the intention of this one was kind of to delve into the mind of like an entrepreneur, which you obviously are, and not just an entrepreneur, like, you created your business, but you're always your business is built around like innovation, like what's the next thing? How can we plan ahead for the next like 10 years? And so I was just wondering if there were any great inspirations early on and any current collaborations that kind of keep you motivated, that keep that spark alive, that keep you going. Because, running a business, there's always like the redundancy and like the mundane parts of it. So kind of that, because I think it's important for other people to think outside the box. It's nice to work at a job, but it's also having this conversation, hearing about all your work is like, when you do it yourself, you start with one thing and then you kind of like wherever it takes you, it kind of morphs into its own entity. So any inspirations that kind of like started you on this path, and then also any collaborations that are like lit a fire in me?
I would say, well, my previous work, Rana Creek, and Paul Kephart, my boss there, was a great inspiration, just like sort of an ecological process, but also like trialing and testing stuff. He was very into like, let's build a trial, see which plants survive. Let's build this roof at this slope. So for me, that was a big thing of like kind of developing what I would call like research and practice, because a lot of designers or engineers are constrained by like, well, we've never done this. and I don't want to take the risk because we're going to put our stamp on it if it all dies. Or it's like you're working on a $200 million museum, and if you completely fail, right, it's like you fall on your face, people freak out or sue us, right, at the worst case scenario. So for us, it's sort of like trying to set expectations differently, but also do that research preemptively. And then big projects realize like, well, we might actually have 3 years from when we design it. But another good inspiration is a firm in Philadelphia called Kieran Timberlake. They're really cool, more architecture focused, but they have a really strong research team. And it was really interesting. Like we'd worked on some projects with them, but then I saw during 2008, their research team was like the only folks they didn't lay off at all in that major downturn, just because it was like the engine of their business, which I saw really cool. We've also been inspired by like a lot of academic partners we work with, because you've moved from being in like a kind of consulting realm where, you know, you're working from one project to the next and trying to get another project, and maybe a project's getting built in a couple of years and it's pretty fast turnover, to working on these like really long extended grants where it might be 3 years from when we apply to when we get it. And so this one researcher I worked with was said, well, I'm always writing a grant for something I've already figured out, but then that's going to help me fund the next thing that's super innovative. And so it's kind of, we're trying to hopscotch in that sense. So it's like a bunch of the grants we're getting, we've already done a bunch of the work and know it's going to work. And then we're going to use that money to, you know, do the next stage. And it's also the sort of thing where it's like, if I had tried this on day one when we started the business, we would have totally fell on our face, because it's just like we couldn't sustain cash flow wise like these giant delays. So it's like realizing that like take on those bigger projects, you need to have like a longer term flywheel, I guess I would call it, where you've got like certain projects already coming through that you applied for years ago so that you can go for riskier ones. And then a lot of it for us was sort of shifting from like answering, I would just say like answering the phone for what people were calling us for because they saw our last project, which we did a lot at the beginning, to then charting a direction. You know, early on, we were kind of Robin Hooding, I would say, where we were like using high-end residential clients or big museum clients to like fund our staff. And then we'd be doing like more of the EJ work just on the side or in the background. And we've never been very good business people, but we've survived, which I guess means we're decent. But like we're not like super driven towards high profit, but our problem is we'll just pour all the money into research. So what we started shifting to is saying like, let's actually get grants for that stuff that we were just spending our profit on. And also let's like be really more intentional to say like, okay, we really want to work with environmental justice communities. It's harder. They're not going to be able to pay us as much as a high-end client, right? But let's like try to flip the model. So we started just like proactively writing grants with them. And also we kind of stopped responding to standard RFPs, but instead we would like start working with nonprofits and start working with the city and basically like sculpt a project, right? So like we're working county of LA right now with a bunch of nonprofits and the county. And so we're like helping conceptualize the contract that we might have in a year instead of like just going after an RFP that came out. So it takes longer, but I think that's an interesting, our approach, I guess, and sort of charting a course to say, well, we want our business to primarily be EJ. So we went from that being kind of our interest to now like 80% of our projects are that, but it is not easy. And the other thing coming to also is we're small enough where I think we're able to be agile. I think the challenge is when you get bigger, it's harder to kind of destroy your previous business model. Whereas we're happy to like burn down what we did before and be working on something new, or to say like, hey, we were really innovative in pushing like gray water and rainwater, but now there's a bunch of awesome firms that are our friends that are doing that. Like we don't need to do it anymore. You know, like Water Sprout and Dig and all these great people in the Bay. You know, what we're really doing is saying like, the biggest challenge right now is we want to have scale our impact, be able to work with more communities around the country. And so that's why we've shifted like these latest grants we've gotten from the National Science Foundation. I jokingly sort of say are trying to put ourselves out of business because we're basically building software to do a lot of what we do so that we can actually offer it. You know, it's like for us to do some complex air simulation model all by hand, it might cost like $50,000 or $100,000 of some human's time here. But now we're really trying to leverage automation. And as everyone's like getting excited or freaked out about AI and ChatGPT, we always see like the human's going to be like a critical piece in like actually collaborating, working with the community. But, you know, when we think about it as just one piece of what we do, it's like in the project in Louisville, we had one of our staff member, May, who's sort of plant specialist, Louisville. She,
Glad to do
she,
it.
you know, she spends hundreds of hours like placing plant circles and then replacing those plant circles when like those plants aren't available, and it's just like not worth the human's time. So a lot of what we're doing is like, can we automate all that and have her be able to drive it, and it rearranges it, and we're like, here's what's actually available, here's now the best packing. So for us, it's like taking humans out where possible so that it can empower us to like do the environmental justice work and be able to work with more communities that can afford it, you know, rather than just being like, oh, it's really expensive to do this work, so like only high-end residential people can do it, you know. So I think that's our motivation.
It's really interesting in landscape design. When you design it versus when you install it is like a different time frame, and depending on that, like what's available at the nursery, what's, you know, what's healthy, what actually looks good,
Exactly.
is, you know, like that is something that's huge. So that's why I like design build, is because like the designer can actually make those decisions on the fly, or
Exactly.
substitute something that is the same height, size, width, habitat, creating color. But yeah, like things look better and things are healthier in the spring or in the summer growing in a pot. I'll ask you some more another time about the AI and how to synthesize that. Well, I think one of the last things I wanted to touch on, so the last podcast we did with Suzanne Arca from Arca Design Group, and one of the questions, I forget what it was something about, in your 40 years of experience, like what have you noticed in changes and shifts in the industry? And her answer, I was like, is it the environment? Is it, you know, climate change? And her answer was that she's like, you know, 40 years ago, like I didn't have a hard time finding horticulturalists. Like I didn't have a hard time finding, like I put an ad out for gardener and I get like 30 different people like applying. And she's like, now I have to like source a million people, and not a million people, but source like a lot of people, and I might get one good, you know, applicant. And she was saying how like in the design, in the schools, like they're not, like I think UC Berkeley stopped teaching horticulture. They're just doing only design. You know, a lot of landscape architecture schools are just only teaching design. In your work, like if you had a magic wand you could wave, what environmental, social, political change would you like to see in the green movement?
That's a really good question. I have the same sentiment where, you know, we're hiring people coming out of Berkeley and other schools, and I'm like dumbfounded by how little people know about plants that are coming out of a landscape architecture program. So my general approach is like, we actually have UC Berkeley classes and people come through our studio a lot and like hire, you know, we have interns from a lot of the schools. My general approach is that I'm generally more impressed by people coming out of community colleges that actually have more robust horticulture programs. So that's where I've been like really supporting Merit's program, and like they're now starting an arborist program. I joke with some of the professors because I'm like, don't bring these students here if you want me to tell them to keep going to school. I like try to tell them to all quit going to college, because I just feel like our college isn't prepared for a lot of this. I actually am more interested in like apprenticeship models that I think would actually train people better on these skills. And I think what we'll see is like, as artificial intelligence takes some of what we thought were the higher paying jobs, people are going to return to being like, a horticulturalist is a skill we can't recreate. You know, I can place trees, like I can get rid of the drafter, but I can't get rid of that knowledge, right? And nor would you want to, right? Like, and so I think that's the compelling piece. I think it's just changing our education paradigm. And you know, that's where we also see people like coming out of Cal Poly, for example, are way more practically educated than coming out of Berkeley, right? On a lot of those things. I also am seeing this interesting thing kind of like within the field. I guess it's sort of like, which disciplines do we need? Where do we need them? I see this problem where like urban forestry is becoming, you know, in vogue. We're talking about actually getting funding through like Justice 40, and Biden administration just put like $1 billion to urban forestry. We're helping groups apply for it. The problem right now is like the people to actually do that work are severely limited. Like we're limited in who's available.
Yeah.
And I think there's interesting step that's happening too, where it's like urban greening was so emaciated as an industry and underfunded that like it was basically just was regulated to like community groups and volunteers trying to get a bunch of trees in. And now I think we need to like kind of reintegrate the landscape trades back into it, because we're working with community groups where they're saying like, we've got like we've got 20 students for a month and they can plant like 10 trees a day. And I'm like, you got 20 kids and they can only plant 10 trees. Like I need you to plant like 1,000 trees a day.
And that we just did a school volunteer thing. Like we had like 20 kids. They planted like 4 trees, you know, like 10 in like really bad soil. That's like very ambitious.
So like, I wouldn't want to take away that educational opportunity. I mean, it's great. We need to continue that, but we need to then say like, this is not how we need to, you know, reforest our urban centers, right? Like we need to industrialize it, is maybe like a wrong term, but it's like, we need to bring the landscape industry in, right? It's like, we have expert landscapers, people like you who like are running crews, doing it well, building beautiful things, and just amazing, hardworking community out there. And so like, one of the big things we're trying to do is work with nonprofits who are helping write these grants and say like, don't do all this work yourself, like do some with students, but let's actually like try to, you know, empower and build up, you know, small minority locally owned contractors. A lot of times it's like hard for them to get the bonds to do a city project. So we're working with the city of Oakland right now to do, we got a grant from the state to plant 4,000 trees in West Oakland and to do a lot of sidewalk improvements as well, like pedestrian improvements. And we're trying to say like, we don't need to do the construction for a year or two, but let's start now, like identifying the small contractors, seeing what their hurdle is to being able to get bonded or funded, and like build up this kind of green jobs workforce in an effective way. And I also think beyond just the planting, there's really compelling new parts of like teaching them around the air quality monitoring or water quality monitoring and the ecosystem services, so that we can like actually provide jobs that can pay enough to keep these people in our community, right? So those are like big pieces for me, is like building the industry up.
If you're working for a landscape company and you're just installing like, you know, high-end trees for high-end, there's kind of this like, oh, another rich person, versus like, oh, I'm actually doing something that's benefiting the community that I'm part of. So there's more.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of brings up a big component that I sometimes get into disagreements with nonprofits about, is like, I sort of see a lot of like philanthropic work as a crutch. And also it's interesting because I see it as it's sort of like a broken capitalist driven form, where basically we've got people giving away money that have too much of it because they have to, but then they're saying like, I'm going to decide where this goes. And I'm specifically going to say that you, as the community I'm giving it to, cannot profit off of the money that I'm giving you, right? Where I am actually interested in equity from like a financial equity standpoint too. It's like, why can't this small local business be benefiting from the philanthropist and like that person building equity in their community? Like, I think that's a huge thing that's not addressed.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's a great idea.
I remember there was this project, it was done by Friends of the Urban Forest. It's kind of a tangent, but similar. And it was in Hunters Point in San Francisco. And it was like the worst, you know, San Francisco's changed a lot, but this was like 15 years ago. And they basically did a greening of the whole street. You know, they broke up the sidewalks, they did median planters and planted trees and like pebbles, little dry creek drainage basins. And literally the crime went down like 90% in like a month. Just that, and I'm sure there's a million other research stories to it, but just that story in itself is like, you know, we really take trees and planting for granted. I think it's a lot easier to want to have like a remodeled kitchen or bathroom, but the actual like benefit of our greenscapes is huge.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about the name that you chose, Hyphae Design, what Hyphae means, and its essence and benefit for the whole ecosystem.
The one thing we don't want it to mean, which a lot of people jokingly say, is that we charge high fees.
Oh, I thought it was like Hyphae, like like Oakland, like we're Hyphae.
Yeah, so that's what we don't want it to be. No, I'm joking. So yeah, it comes obviously like our origins are in Oakland. Like I'm very into hip hop and that community. I just like loved also the playfulness and like integration of the hip hop community. So big advocate, not just on like a conceptual level, but just like culturally. Yeah, it was really this idea of both the metaphor of, like what Hyphae are. So, the idea that they are sort of like what do they call it? The World Wood Web, or, some people would say, but it's sort of like the neurons that are communicating in the forest and really allowing like, nutrients and soil to communicate and trees to communicate to each other. So it was really about this like interconnectedness was for us a metaphor. And then obviously just like the practical fact that hyphae are so critically important to like nutrient cycling and sort of water harvesting, everything from like a practical standpoint down to like a lot of my early work and our continued work, especially in EJ communities, is like decontaminating these overly industrialized communities. So it's like kind of leveraging that as like a bioremediation tool is really central to our work, just practically. So I would say those are really the big drivers for us, and sort of like, but also using it as a metaphor. And it's funny because I think you fall into this very small Venn diagram where people both know like the Hyphae hip hop movement and mycelium hyphae. So I think it's probably like a high percentage of folks in the Bay Area, but everywhere else, people are all either like, oh my God, Hyphae hip hop or Hyphae mycelium.
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems like, you did create that name and you like set an intention, and then you actually are doing that in your work in terms of bringing multiple disciplines together and helping actually feed them and benefit each other, because everyone has their strength. And
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's kind of the role of an ecologist too. Like as we are often on the project, it's like looking at the system and how it all interacts rather than any one specific discipline.
Really nice to meet you, Brent. Inspiring to hear your enthusiasm for what you're doing, and also just how diversified your interests are.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really excited. So anyways, this podcast is called Creating Spaces. We do a live Zoom once a month, and then the recordings will be posted on YouTube at Alana_Art Garden. And I'm really excited. I think the next one is going to be from like a local farmer and like medicine worker here in the Bay Area. So kind of just pulling in multiple disciplines to discuss like, creating spaces.
Yeah, really. That's where we live. It's the ecosystem. Anytime we open our eyes or open our ears or feel the wind, we're in the ecosystem of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I thank you everyone for coming.
I love what you're starting. So if I can help grow the Hyphae network here and connect other cool people to interview, let me know.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. It's great having you. All right. Bye.